Imagine waking up on the morning of June 1st, 1921, in the wealthiest black neighborhood in the entire United States. Your home is a 2-story brick house on Greenwood Avenue. You have a car. Your children attend a well-funded school. Your neighbors are doctors, lawyers, dentists, hotel owners, and theater managers. You have built something that your grandparents, born into slavery, could never have dreamed possible. You have built a life so prosperous, so full, so undeniably American that the white newspapers have given your neighborhood a nickname. They call it the Black Wall Street of America. Now imagine that within the next 18 hours, every single thing you have ever built will be burned to ash. Your home, your business, your church, your school. And this is the part that history textbooks buried for decades. Imagine that the planes come, biplanes, circling low over your neighborhood in the early morning light, while your streets are filled with screaming families and the crack of rifle fire. Imagine being bombed, in America, by your own government. This is not a story from a foreign war. This is not ancient history. This happened on American soil in Tulsa, Oklahoma in the year 1921, and for almost 50 years it was erased. Suppressed, hidden. The official government records were sealed. Survivors were told to stay silent. Newspapers stopped reporting. An entire massacre, the worst act of racial violence in American history, was quietly removed from the public record as if it had never happened at all. But it happened. And today you are going to hear every single detail. Before we continue, comment below with the country you're watching from. And if you enjoy forgotten history, subscribe and join our community. Stories like this one deserve to be told, and people like you are why they finally are. To understand how Black Wall Street was born, you have to go back much further than 1921. You have to go back to a promise made and broken. You have to go back to the red dirt of Oklahoma Territory, and to a man named Edward Preston McCabe. It was 1889 and the federal government was opening up Oklahoma Territory for settlement. In the land run of April 22nd, thousands of white settlers thundered across the starting line on horseback and in wagons, racing to stake their claim on free land. But Edward McCabe had a different vision entirely. McCabe was black, a former state auditor from Kansas, educated and politically shrewd. And he saw Oklahoma not as a place to simply settle, but as a place to build something radical. He wanted to create an all-black state, a sovereign territory where black Americans, newly freed from slavery just 2 decades before, still terrorized across the South, could govern themselves, could vote freely, could build wealth without fear. McCabe wrote letters. He lobbied Congress. He traveled the country speaking to black communities, urging them to come to Oklahoma, to flood the territory with black settlers fast enough that when statehood came, they would be the majority. Dozens of all-black towns began to spring up across Oklahoma Territory. Langston, Boley, Rentisville, Taft. More than 50 all-black municipalities would eventually be founded in what would become the state of Oklahoma. It was an extraordinary, audacious experiment in black self-determination, but the all-black state never came. White settlers arrived in far greater numbers. When Oklahoma entered the Union in 1907, its very first act as a state was to pass the Grandfather Clause, a law designed specifically to disenfranchise black voters. The dream of black political sovereignty died almost before it was born. And yet something survived. Something incredible. In the northeastern corner of Oklahoma, a black man named O.W. Gurley had purchased 40 acres of land in a neighborhood just north of Tulsa's railroad tracks. He made a decision that would change history. He would sell or rent that land only to black buyers. By 1906, a small but growing community was taking shape along a street named Greenwood Avenue, named for a city in Mississippi. And Greenwood would become something no one had fully anticipated. The geographic and legal segregation that was supposed to hold black Tulsa down instead created something extraordinary. an almost entirely self-contained black economy. Because black residents were barred from white-owned stores, restaurants, hotels, and theaters, they built their own. Every dollar spent in Greenwood stayed in Greenwood. Local businesses served local families. Profits were reinvested. Wealth compounded. Generation after generation, brick by brick, the neighborhood grew. By the early 1920s, the Greenwood district was home to more than 10,000 black residents. Greenwood Avenue itself was lined with two-story brick buildings, law offices, medical clinics, 2 newspapers, 2 movie theaters, a public library, over 30 grocery stores, more than a dozen hotels, billiard halls, barbershops, beauty salons, nightclubs where jazz musicians played until dawn. Dr. A.C. Jackson, regarded by the Mayo Clinic as one of the most gifted surgeons in America, had his practice there. Simon Berry ran a profitable bus line and hotel. J.B. Stratford owned the Stratford Hotel, one of the largest black-owned hotels in the country, with 65 rooms of gleaming mahogany and polished brass. John Hope Franklin, who would go on to become one of America's greatest historians, grew up in the Greenwood district as a child. His father, Buck Franklin, was a lawyer with an office on Greenwood Avenue. When young John Hope Franklin walked to school in the morning, he passed doctors' offices and insurance companies and a photography studio and a law library. He grew up believing, because the evidence was all around him, that black Americans could build anything. Booker T. Washington visited the Greenwood district in 1905 and was so astonished by what he found that he coined the phrase that would follow Greenwood through history. He called it the Negro Wall Street of America. The name stuck, the pride spread, and in white Tulsa something else was quietly growing too. Something uglier, something dangerous. Tulsa in the early 1920s was a boomtown running hot on oil money. Just 15 miles south of Greenwood, white roughnecks and oil executives were making fortunes almost overnight. The city's white population was growing faster than its infrastructure. Racial tensions, always present beneath the surface of Jim Crow, Oklahoma, were tightening. The Ku Klux Klan was experiencing a terrifying national resurgence. By 1924, it would claim 4 million members across the United States, and Tulsa was one of its strongholds. KKK rallies drew thousands. Local politicians either belonged to the Klan or were afraid to oppose it. The Tulsa Tribune, the city's leading white newspaper, regularly ran anti-black editorials that stoked fear and resentment, and beneath all of it ran a current of something white Tulsa could barely name but could not stop feeling: envy. Because whatever the newspapers said about black inferiority, you couldn't walk past Greenwood Avenue and deny what you saw. You couldn't look at the Stratford Hotel and pretend it wasn't magnificent. You couldn't watch black Tulsans drive their automobiles down Archer Street and not feel something complicated twist in your chest. In 1921, the white population of Tulsa outnumbered the black population roughly 9-1. And the white establishment had a newspaper, a police department, and a sitting government. All it needed was a spark. The spark arrived on May 30th, 1921, Memorial Day. A 19-year-old black man named Dick Rowland was working as a shoe shiner at a stand in downtown Tulsa. He worked long hours, saved carefully, and was by all accounts a polite and quiet young man. The elevator in the Drexel building on Main Street was operated by a 17-year-old white girl named Sarah Page. At some point that morning, Dick Rowland stepped into that elevator. Exactly what happened next has never been definitively established, and that uncertainty, that single moment of historical ambiguity, would become the detonator for one of the worst atrocities ever committed on American soil. Someone, no one knows who, reported to the police that Dick Rowland had assaulted Sarah Page. There was no investigation. There was no verification. By the end of the day, Rowland had been arrested and taken to the Tulsa County Courthouse. Sarah Page, for her part, apparently refused to press charges. She would later insist that no assault had taken place. She may have known Dick Rowland personally. Some historians believe the two may have been in a romantic relationship, an act that was not only socially condemned but could mean death for a black man in 1921 Oklahoma. But none of that mattered now, because the Tulsa Tribune had already printed its story. The headline ran on the afternoon of May 30th. It read, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in an elevator." The story went further. It contained a short editorial on the same page, the original copy of which was later physically cut out of every archived edition of that newspaper, a destruction of evidence so deliberate it amounts to a confession that is believed to have called for a lynching. By nightfall, a crowd of hundreds of armed white men had gathered outside the Tulsa County Courthouse. They were there for Dick Rowland. They intended to take him out of that jail and kill him. Word spread through the Greenwood district with terrifying speed. Black veterans of World War I, men who had fought in the trenches of France, who had been told that their service would earn them dignity and citizenship back home, who had returned to find the same Jim Crow laws and the same terror waiting for them. Those men did not hesitate. They armed themselves, they organized, and they marched on the courthouse. A group of approximately 70, 5 armed black men arrived at the Tulsa County Courthouse that night and offered to help the sheriff protect the prisoner. The sheriff, Willard McCullough, told them to go home. He said he had the situation under control. The black men began to withdraw. The exact moment at which it all went wrong has been debated ever since. But somewhere in the darkness, near the courthouse steps, a shot was fired. One shot, and then the night exploded. Armed white men and armed black men were suddenly exchanging fire in the streets of downtown Tulsa. Outnumbered and pushed back, the black defenders retreated north, toward the Greenwood district, fighting as they went. By the time they crossed the Frisco Railroad tracks into Greenwood, they had taken casualties. And behind them, the white mob, now swelling into the thousands, armed by local gun stores that had thrown open their doors, deputized by the Tulsa police who handed out weapons and badges to white civilians, was coming. What happened next was not a riot. Do not call it a riot. Historians have spent decades insisting on this distinction, and it matters enormously. A riot implies mutual violence, mutual chaos, rough moral equivalence. What happened to the Greenwood district in the early morning hours of June 1, 1921, was a massacre, an invasion, a military assault on a civilian neighborhood. The Tulsa police did not protect Greenwood. They participated in its destruction. Officers arrested black residents at gunpoint and marched them to detention centers, a high school gymnasium, the convention hall, and the fairgrounds, where more than 6,000 black Tulsans would eventually be held. In order to move freely through the streets of their own neighborhood, black residents were required to have a white guardian vouch for them and pin a white card to their clothing. If they did not have that white card, they were arrested. The police force of the city of Tulsa in the early morning of June 1, 1921, was functioning as the enforcement arm of a white supremacist invasion. The invaders came across the tracks just before dawn, thousands of armed white men, and the estimates range from 5,000 to 10,000, moved through the streets of the Greenwood district in the darkness before sunrise. They set fires with torches, and with oil from the service stations they looted as they advanced. They shot any black man they found on the street. They shot people who were trying to flee. They dragged people out of their homes and shot them in their yards. They set churches on fire with people still inside. They looted every business before they burned it. And then came the part that no official account would acknowledge for decades. The planes. The National Guard had been called in, but not to stop the massacre. Oklahoma Governor James Robertson declared martial law on the morning of June 1st. But the National Guard's initial role in Greenwood was to assist in the rounding up and detention of black residents, not to protect them. What the Guard and local authorities also had, however, was access to aircraft. And in the skies above the Greenwood district, in the smoke-filled dawn of June 1st, 1921, biplanes appeared. Survivors, men and women who had lived through that morning and spent their lives trying to make people believe them, testified consistently and in detail. They saw planes flying low over the neighborhood. They heard firing from the planes. Some reported seeing incendiary devices dropped from the aircraft. Firefighters who responded to Greenwood that morning, white firefighters from the city of Tulsa, were reportedly turned away or ordered to stand down as the fires spread. For decades, the official record denied that aircraft played any offensive role. The planes were surveillance, authorities claimed. Just observation, reconnaissance, but then the testimonies piled up, too consistent and too detailed to dismiss. And then the photographs emerged. Aerial photographs taken on the morning of June 1st, 1921, showing the Greenwood district from above while it burned. Someone was up there with a camera, and the commission that investigated the massacre in 2001 concluded that the evidence strongly supports the use of private aircraft by law enforcement personnel, and that the possibility of gunfire from the aircraft could not be ruled out. In the space of roughly 16 hours, the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, 35 blocks of homes and businesses, churches and schools, the accumulated wealth and labor of an entire generation of black Americans, was completely destroyed. 35 blocks gone. The numbers, when the smoke cleared, were staggering. More than 200 homes had been burned to the ground. 35 blocks of the most prosperous black neighborhood in the United States had been reduced to ash and rubble. Schools, churches, the public library, the Stratford Hotel with its gleaming mahogany lobby, the offices of both black newspapers, Dr. Jackson's medical clinic, every grocery store, every restaurant, every law office, every beauty salon, gone. The official death toll recorded at the time was 39, 26 black, 13 white. But no one believed that number even then. Black victims were being buried in mass graves, thrown into the Arkansas River, loaded onto freight cars and transported out of the city. Their deaths simply not counted. Modern historians and forensic investigators believe the actual death toll was likely between 100 and 300 black Tulsans, possibly higher. The precise number will probably never be known. And then came the second crime, the cover-up. Within days of the massacre, the machinery of erasure began to move. The Tulsa Tribune, whose headline may have started the entire catastrophe, ran almost no coverage of the destruction. The city government moved immediately to prevent black Tulsans from rebuilding. Within weeks of the massacre, the Tulsa City Commission passed a new fire ordinance requiring all reconstruction in the Greenwood area to use fireproof materials, a regulation that would make rebuilding prohibitively expensive for people who had just lost everything. The transparent goal was to seize the Greenwood land for white-owned commercial development. City officials proposed using the burned district for a new train depot and warehouse district. Black Tulsans filed lawsuits. They organized. They demanded justice. And they received nothing. The grand jury convened to investigate the massacre produced an astonishing document. It concluded that the violence had been caused by, and these are the actual words, the black community itself, for having attempted to protect Dick Rowland. The official position of the state of Oklahoma was that black Tulsans had brought the destruction of their own neighborhood upon themselves by resisting a lynch mob. Not a single white participant in the massacre was ever tried, convicted, or punished, not one. Meanwhile, insurance companies denied virtually every claim filed by black Tulsans on the grounds that the destruction had been caused by a riot. Even though the destruction had been caused by an organized, Government-assisted massacre. The legal distinction, exploited with cynical precision, meant that black Tulsans were left with nothing. Not justice, not compensation, not even an acknowledgement that a crime had been committed. And now came the most insidious part: the erasure of memory itself. Within a generation, the Tulsa Race Massacre had vanished from the public record. It disappeared from Oklahoma history textbooks. The Tulsa Tribune's inflammatory editorial was physically cut out of archived editions. A deliberate act of destruction, so careful that the hole in the archive is itself a piece of evidence. Survivors. The people who had lived through that night, who had hidden in their basements while their neighborhoods burned, who had been marched at gunpoint to detention centers, who had seen their neighbors shot. Those survivors were quietly, consistently, informally told not to talk about it, by neighbors, by employers, by authorities, by anyone who wanted the city to move on, by anyone for whom the truth was inconvenient. John Hope Franklin, the boy who had grown up on Greenwood Avenue watching his father practice law in a prosperous black city, would go on to become one of America's most distinguished historians. He earned his doctorate from Harvard. He wrote 16 books. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and for most of his professional life, he did not write about the Tulsa Race Massacre, not because he didn't know. Because he had been taught, in the way that the South teaches things, through silence and suggestion and the quiet fear that speaking too loudly about the wrong things could cost you everything. He had been taught that this particular truth was not safe to tell. His father, Buck Franklin, was one of the survivors. Buck Franklin's law office on Greenwood Avenue burned on June 1, 1921. He lost everything, and he rebuilt. That, too, is part of the story, because what the erasers could not fully erase was the stubborn, magnificent, infuriating resilience of the Greenwood community itself. Within 72 hours of the massacre, black Tulsans were already beginning to rebuild. They set up tents in the rubble of their neighborhood. They cooked meals over open fires in the wreckage of their churches. They held community meetings, organized mutual aid, pooled whatever resources they had managed to save or hide. The city's attempts to prevent reconstruction, the new fire ordinance, the rezoning proposals, the efforts to seize the land, were met with legal challenges, political organizing, and a community-wide refusal to simply disappear. Buck Franklin set up a law practice in a tent. He worked in that tent, surrounded by the ruins of the neighborhood he had helped build, and he filed lawsuits. The lawsuits went nowhere, but he filed them anyway. Slowly, painfully, the Greenwood district rebuilt itself, not to its former glory, not immediately. The economic losses were catastrophic and permanent for many families. But within a decade, Greenwood Avenue was again lined with businesses. By the late 1930s and into the 1940s, the district had partially recovered. It would never fully return to what it had been on May 31, 1921, and then came the second destruction. This one was quieter. This one came dressed in the language of progress. In the 1960s and 1970s, urban renewal programs across the United States used federal highway funding to route new highways directly through black neighborhoods. The process was so consistent, so deliberate, so geographically specific in its targeting of communities of color that historians and urban planners have given it a name: urban removal. In Tulsa, Interstate 244 was routed directly through the heart of the Greenwood district. The highway construction demolished hundreds of homes and businesses. The economic vitality of Greenwood, already damaged by decades of disinvestment, was shattered. The neighborhood that had survived the massacre of 1921 could not survive the urban renewal bulldozers of the 1970s. By 1980, Greenwood Avenue was a ghost of itself. A few historic buildings survived. A small stretch of the original district remained. But the community that had once supported 10,000 residents, that had once housed 30, 5 blocks of prosperous black commerce had been reduced to a few blocks of struggling small businesses and empty lots. For decades, the massacre remained the city's open secret, something that old people occasionally whispered about, that historians in other cities knew about, but that Tulsa itself refused to officially acknowledge. The city's identity as a progressive oil boomtown required a particular kind of amnesia, and that amnesia held more or less for nearly 50 years. Then a woman named Juanita Hopkins, a schoolteacher in North Tulsa, started asking her students about the history of their own neighborhood. It was the late 1960s. Her students were the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of massacre survivors, and they had never been taught anything about what had happened in 1921. She started collecting testimonies. She started interviewing survivors. She became part of a small but growing network of black Tulsans who refused to let the story die. In 1971, on the 50th anniversary of the massacre, a group of black Tulsans organized a commemoration. White Tulsa largely ignored it. But within the black community, something was shifting. Survivors who had spent 50 years keeping silence were beginning to speak. Not loudly, not publicly, but in church basements and living rooms and family dinners, the stories were being told again. The academic reckoning came slowly. In the 1970s, historian Scott Ellsworth began researching the massacre as a young graduate student at Duke University. He couldn't find the Tribune's editorial. Someone had cut it out of every archived copy. He found that official records had been systematically removed or destroyed. He found that survivors, when he finally located them, were often still afraid to speak on the record. In 1982, Ellsworth published Death in a Promised Land, the first serious historical account of the Tulsa Race Massacre. It was not a bestseller. It was not assigned in Oklahoma schools. But it existed. The public reckoning, the one that made national headlines, did not come until 1997. That year, the Oklahoma State Legislature commissioned the Tulsa Race Riot Commission to officially investigate what had happened in 1921. The commission's mandate was extraordinary in its scope. It would examine primary sources, survivor testimony, forensic evidence, and government records. It would try to establish an accurate death toll. It would consider whether reparations were owed. The commission worked for 4 years. In 2001, it issued a report that made headlines around the world. It confirmed that what had happened in 1921 was a massacre, not a riot. It confirmed that law enforcement had participated in the violence. It confirmed that government officials had failed to protect black citizens and had actively aided the destruction of the Greenwood district. It found evidence consistent with gunfire from aircraft. It estimated the true death toll at somewhere between 100 and 300 people. It concluded that the city of Tulsa and the state of Oklahoma bore moral and legal responsibility for what had happened. And then, and this is the part that reopened wounds that had never fully healed, it recommended reparations. The commission recommended direct payments to massacre survivors and their descendants. It recommended a memorial. It recommended economic development investment in the Greenwood area. The report was adopted. The memorial was eventually built. The economic development programs were partially implemented, but the direct reparations, the actual payments to survivors and descendants, were never made. The Oklahoma legislature refused. As the report gathered dust, the surviving witnesses to the massacre were dying. By 2001, only a handful were still alive. They had been children in 1921, babies, toddlers, young children who remembered the fires and the gunshots and the terror, who remembered being carried through smoke-filled streets in their mother's arms. By the time the commission issued its report, they were in their 80s and 90s. One of them was Viola Fletcher. Born in 1905, she was 7 years old on the night the massacre began. She remembered watching her family home burn. She remembered being separated from her parents in the chaos. She remembered the planes, For nearly a century she carried that memory. In 2021, on the centennial of the massacre, Viola Fletcher, now 107 years old, traveled to Washington, D.C., and testified before the United States Congress. She sat in a wheelchair before the House Judiciary Subcommittee on the Constitution, Civil Rights, and Civil Liberties, and she spoke. "I am 107 years old," she said. "I have been blessed with a long life, and I am not afraid to tell the truth. I will never forget the night of the massacre. I still see the bodies, I still smell the smoke, I still see the fire, I still hear people screaming. I have lived through the massacre every day." She paused. She looked at the committee members. "I am here today asking for justice," she said. "I lived through the night of the massacre every single night. Viola Fletcher died on October 1st, 2023. She was 109 years old. She never received reparations. Neither did any other survivor or descendant of the Tulsa Race Massacre. But the story was no longer buried. The centennial in 2021 brought a wave of national and international attention unlike anything the massacre had received before. Books were published. Documentaries were produced. The HBO series Watchmen, which premiered in 2019, had opened its first episode with a harrowing dramatic recreation of the massacre, introducing the history to millions of viewers who had never heard of it. Suddenly, Tulsa 1921 was everywhere, in the news, in academic papers, in congressional hearings, in social media feeds around the world. For many Americans, it was the first time they had ever encountered the story. For Black Tulsans, it was something more complicated. A validation after a century of silence, mixed with grief over how long the validation had taken, and anger that it had come without the one thing that the survivors had actually asked for. The question of reparations remained and remains unresolved. In 2021, a lawsuit was filed on behalf of the two surviving massacre victims and their descendants, arguing that the city of Tulsa and the state of Oklahoma had created and maintained a public nuisance through their failure to address the massacre and its ongoing economic consequences. The lawsuit sought a remedy under a seldom used Oklahoma law. It was a creative and historic legal strategy. In 2023, a Tulsa County District Court dismissed the lawsuit, ruling that the plaintiffs lacked legal standing. An appeal was filed. The legal battle continues. The broader economic argument for reparations is, when examined carefully, almost inarguable in its logic. The Greenwood district's destruction was not a natural disaster, not an accident, not a riot. It was a government-assisted theft. The city of Tulsa participated in the destruction of property that its own citizens had built and paid taxes on. The police force deputized the men who set those fires. The National Guard arrested the victims. The city then moved to prevent rebuilding through deliberate regulatory and legal obstruction. And then the government sat on the story for half a century, denying the victims even the dignity of acknowledgement. By any normal understanding of property rights and governmental liability, the city of Tulsa owes something to the descendants of those whose property it helped destroy. The question of how much and to whom and through what mechanism, those are genuinely difficult questions. But the underlying moral and legal claim is not difficult at all. What makes the Tulsa story so important, so shattering, so necessary, is not just the massacre itself, as horrific as it was. It is what the massacre reveals about the mechanics of American racial inequality. Because Greenwood was not destroyed despite its success. It was destroyed because of its success. The white mobs who poured across the Frisco Railroad tracks in the early morning of June 1st, 1921, were not driven by abstract racial hatred alone. They were driven by something more specific and more devastating. The sight of black prosperity in a country that had told them black inferiority was a natural law. The Greenwood district was, in its very existence, a living refutation of everything that white supremacy required its believers to believe. And so it had to be destroyed. And here is the pattern that makes historians' blood run cold. Greenwood was not unique. Across the early 20th century United States, prosperous black communities were attacked, burned, and destroyed with disturbing regularity. Rosewood, Wilmington, North Carolina. The Elaine Massacre in Arkansas, Ocoee, Florida, Springfield, Illinois, East St. Louis, Illinois. In each case, black economic success and black political organization preceded the violence. In each case, white mobs attacked with either the active assistance or the passive complicity of local law enforcement. In each case, the perpetrators faced no legal consequences. In each case, the official history attempted to minimize or erase what had happened. The pattern is not accidental. The pattern is a policy. Not a written policy, not an explicitly articulated one, but a consistent, repeated, systematic pattern of destroying black wealth and black political power whenever it rose too high. American historians have a phrase for it. They call it the destruction of black Reconstruction. After the Civil War, during the period from 1865 to 1877, known as Reconstruction, black Americans made extraordinary political and economic gains. Black men voted in enormous numbers. Black politicians were elected to state legislatures and to Congress. Black-owned businesses flourished. Black churches, schools, and civic institutions were built across the South. For a brief, shining, heartbreaking moment, the promise of American democracy appeared to extend to the people who had been enslaved. And then it was dismantled. Violently, systematically, methodically. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1865 specifically to destroy black Reconstruction through terror. Thousands of black Americans were killed between 1865 and 1900 in a campaign of racial violence so relentless and so strategically focused on black political and economic leadership that it amounts to a counter-revolution. By 1877, when federal troops were withdrawn from the South, the project was largely complete. Black Southerners were re-enslaved by debt peonage, disenfranchised by grandfather clauses and literacy tests and poll taxes, and terrorized into submission by the constant threat of lynching. The Greenwood district was born in the aftermath of that counter-revolution, in the interstices of the Jim Crow system, in a territory new enough that the rigid hierarchies of the Deep South had not yet fully calcified. It was an anomaly, a space where black economic self-determination had found room to breathe, and in 1921, when its success had grown too large to ignore, the machinery of white supremacy moved to eliminate it. But here is the thing that the perpetrators never fully understood, that the silencers and the erasers and the archive cutters could never quite manage to eliminate. You can burn a building. You cannot burn a story. You can cut a page out of a newspaper. You cannot cut a memory out of a child's mind. Dick Rowland, the young shoe shiner whose arrest ignited the massacre, was never tried. The charges against him were quietly dropped. He left Tulsa and eventually settled in the Pacific Northwest, where he lived out his life in obscurity. Almost nothing is known about him after 1921. The young man at the center of one of American history's great catastrophes slipped back into the anonymity from which he had been so violently dragged. Sarah Page, the elevator operator whose name was used to justify so much destruction, also disappeared from the historical record. She moved away from Tulsa, and no one has been able to trace what became of her. The two people whose encounter, whatever it actually was, became the pretext for the massacre never had the chance to tell their own story. J.B. Stratford, the hotelier whose magnificent 65-room hotel was burned to the ground, was charged with inciting the riot. He fled Oklahoma before he could be arrested. He settled in Chicago, where he rebuilt his life as a lawyer. He lived in exile from Tulsa for the rest of his life. In 1996, 75 years after the massacre, the charges against him were formally dropped by the Tulsa County District Attorney. He had been dead for 50 years. Dr. A.C. Jackson, the physician whom the Mayo Clinic had called one of the most gifted surgeons in America, the man who had built a flourishing practice serving both black and white patients in Tulsa, was murdered on June 1, 1921. He came out of his home on Detroit Avenue with his hands raised in surrender, having received assurances from white neighbors that he would be protected. He was shot and killed in his front yard. He was 41 years old. He left behind a wife and children, a medical practice that had served thousands of patients, and a life of service that deserved a very different ending. His murder was never investigated. No one was ever charged. His name for decades appeared in no official account of the massacre. Simon Berry, the bus line operator, survived and eventually rebuilt. So did many of the Greenwood district's residents. The community's revival in the 1920s and 1930s was a genuine testament to human resilience, a refusal to be erased that deserves to stand alongside any story of American determination you have ever been told. The Greenwood Cultural Center, built on Greenwood Avenue in the 1990s, now houses exhibitions documenting the massacre and celebrating the community's history. The John Hope Franklin Reconciliation Park, which opened in 2010, features bronze sculptures commemorating the massacre and the Greenwood district's history. In 2021, for the centennial, a massive new memorial garden was opened, designed to eventually include a museum and a center for racial reconciliation. These are important gestures. They are better than silence. But they are also, as the descendants of massacre survivors have pointed out with patient insistence, gestures. Bronze and gardens cannot rebuild what was burned. Exhibitions cannot compensate for the wealth that was stolen. Reconciliation centers cannot bring back the dead. The economic consequences of the massacre reverberate through Tulsa to this day. The Greenwood district, even after its partial 1920s rebuilding, never fully recovered its pre-massacre economic vitality. The highway construction of the 1960s and 1970s compounded the damage. Today, North Tulsa, the area that includes the former Greenwood district, has poverty rates, unemployment rates, and infant mortality rates that are dramatically higher than the Tulsa average. The median household income in North Tulsa is less than half the city average. The life expectancy gap between black and white Tulsans is more than 5 years. These are not coincidences. These are consequences. They are the direct, traceable, documented economic consequences of the 1921 massacre and the decades of disinvestment, discrimination, and deliberate obstruction that followed it. The poverty of North Tulsa today is not the result of individual choices or cultural failures or any of the other comfortable explanations that allow people to avoid thinking about what actually happened. It is the result of a crime committed in 1921, compounded and extended and deliberately perpetuated for 100 years afterward. There is a question that the massacre forces you to confront, quietly, uncomfortably, if you sit with the history long enough. It is not a comfortable question. It is this: what would America look like today if the Greenwood district had been allowed to survive and grow? Think about what Greenwood was in 1921. A concentrated community of black professionals, entrepreneurs and skilled workers generating wealth, educating children, building institutions. A functioning demonstration that black Americans, given safety, given the right to hold property, given basic access to the institutions of a functioning democracy, could build something extraordinary. What if that community had grown? What if the Greenwood model had been replicated, as its founders had intended, across Oklahoma and across the South? What if the wealth that was accumulated there had been allowed to compound, generation after generation, as white wealth was allowed to compound? We cannot answer that question. We can only look at what was taken and try to understand how much was lost. The story of the Tulsa Race Massacre is, at its deepest level, a story about the relationship between power and memory, about who gets to decide which stories are told and which are buried, about what happens when an entire community's history is officially erased, and about what it takes to bring it back. For almost 50 years, the erasure worked. The archive was cut, the records were sealed, the survivors were silenced. An entire generation of black Tulsans grew up not knowing what had happened to their grandparents, not knowing why their neighborhood was the way it was, not knowing the full scale of what had been built and what had been destroyed. And then people like Juanita Hopkins started asking questions, and Scott Ellsworth started pulling on threads, and Buck Franklin's son, John Hope Franklin, near the end of his long and magnificent life, started speaking more openly about what he had seen as a boy and what it meant. And the survivors, the ones who were still alive, deep in their 80s and 90s, started talking. And here is what strikes you when you read their testimonies, when you listen to the interviews, when you sit with the stories that were kept alive through 100 years of official silence. What strikes you is not the horror, though the horror is real. What strikes you is the pride, the grief, yes, the anger, absolutely, but underneath all of it, the pride, the memory of what Greenwood was, the insistence that it be known, the refusal to let the burning be the final word. Otis Clark was born in Tulsa in 1905. He was 16 years old during the massacre. He survived by hiding in a church. He watched the fires from a window. He left Tulsa after the massacre and didn't return for decades. He lived to be 109 years old, and in his final years, he spoke about Greenwood with the same tone you might use to describe the most beautiful thing you had ever seen. Not the ashes, the neighborhood, the street, the life. It was something, he said in one of his final interviews, his voice still strong, his eyes still clear. It was really something. I want people to know what it was. Before. That word carries everything. Before the planes, before the fires, before the mob, before the decades of silence and erasure and official denial. Before the highway, before the poverty statistics, before all the losses that compounded the first, original loss. What it was before was this: 35 blocks of black excellence in a country that had tried to make black excellence impossible. A neighborhood where a boy could walk to school past law offices and medical clinics and believe, because the evidence was right there in front of him, that the limits placed on black life in America were not natural laws but decisions. Decisions made by people, which meant they could be unmade. The men and women who built Greenwood were not exceptional in any abstract sense. They were ordinary people who had been freed from slavery, who had survived the terror of Reconstruction's collapse, who had made their way to a new territory looking for something that America had promised and rarely delivered. They were people who had been told their entire lives, in 100 explicit and implicit ways, that they were less than human, and they had looked at that message and decided, collectively, quietly, brick by brick and dollar by dollar, to build proof that it was a lie. They succeeded, and they were punished for succeeding. That is the story of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Not just the massacre itself, the fires and the planes and the bodies and the mass graves, but the story beneath the massacre. The story of what was built and why it was destroyed, and what that destruction tells us about the country that allowed it to happen and then spent 50 years pretending it hadn't. In 2020, a show called Watchmen won 4 Emmy Awards. Its opening sequence, a dramatically recreated version of the massacre, depicting the fires and the chaos and the terror with a visceral, unflinching power, was watched by millions of people who had never heard of Greenwood. The show's creator, Damon Lindelof, said later that he had not known about the massacre until a few years before making the show. He said he was stunned that he didn't know. He said he thought everyone needed to know. He was right. But knowing is only the beginning. The next step, the harder step, is reckoning, not just with what happened, but with what it means. with the systems that made it possible, with the choices that allowed it to be erased, with the ongoing consequences that make it not just history but present reality, with the question of what justice actually looks like, and whether it is still possible, and what it would cost, and whether this country has the will to provide it. Viola Fletcher testified before Congress at 107 years old. She had been asking for justice since 1921. She was still asking in 2021. She died in 2023 without receiving it. The lawsuit filed by massacre survivors and descendants is still working its way through the Oklahoma court system, appealed and challenged and delayed at every turn. The descendants of J.B. Stratford, who lost his hotel, his business, his city, and his home, they are still waiting for something that acknowledges what was taken. The descendants of Dr. A.C. Jackson, shot in his front yard with his hands raised in surrender, they are still waiting for someone to be held accountable. And in North Tulsa, in the neighborhood that was once Black Wall Street, the poverty and the disinvestment and the shortened lives continue. Not because of what happened 100 years ago, but because of what has not happened in the 100 years since. This is the true final revelation of the Tulsa Race Massacre. It is not that the massacre happened. It is that it has never fully ended. The fires went out in 1921, but the burning, the economic burning, the political burning, the burning that shows up in poverty statistics and life expectancy gaps, and the quiet daily reality of life in North Tulsa. That burning is still going. 35 blocks of black excellence, built by the grandchildren of slaves, burned to the ground by a white mob while the police stood aside and the planes circled overhead and the government looked away. And then buried, and then denied, and then partially excavated by stubborn, brave, patient people who refused to let the story die, and then partially acknowledged, and then partially memorialized, and then partially addressed. Partially, always partially, and the rest is still waiting. The planes over Greenwood were not the last time America turned its power against its own people. They were not the first, but they were perhaps the most precise, the most unmistakable, the most difficult to explain away. When a government sends aircraft over a neighborhood full of its own citizens and uses them for whatever purpose, surveillance or assault or something in between, something has been revealed about the nature of power and the limits of citizenship that cannot be taken back. Dick Rowland got on an elevator on the morning of May 30th, 1921, and the world came down on him. He survived. He disappeared. He never spoke publicly about what happened. The city that tried to destroy him in a jail cell was destroyed around him that same night. What did he carry with him for the rest of his life? What did he make of the fact that his arrest became the pretext for the destruction of everything his community had built? History has no answer. He left no memoir. He told no interviewer his story. He simply lived somewhere in the Pacific Northwest for decades after Tulsa, carrying whatever he carried. And in North Tulsa, on Greenwood Avenue, there is a small stretch of brick buildings. Survivors of the massacre. Survivors of the highway, survivors of the slow erasure, where you can walk on the same street that John Hope Franklin walked to school, past the spot where Buck Franklin practiced law in a tent, past the site where the Stratford Hotel once gleamed. The street is quieter than it once was. The 35 blocks are not what they were, but the street is still there. The names are still there. The memory is still there. And the people, the descendants of the people who built it and survived its burning and rebuilt it and watched it be partially dismantled again. They are still there too. They are still waiting for the rest of the story to be told, for the rest of the justice to be done, for the burning that started in 1921 to finally, actually, completely stop. That day has not come yet. But this story that was cut out of archives and sealed in government vaults and whispered only in church basements for half a century, is out now. It cannot be put back. It will not go back. The silence has been broken, and what has been spoken cannot be unspoken. 35 blocks, 16 hours, 100 years of silence, and a question that America has never fully answered. Will it?